All right, you're now on the record.
Anyone online? Aaron's online somewhere. That's new. Sorry, Doug, can you go back?
Sorry.
Have you got control over them?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I'm just wondering why I can't see the.
Oh. Is it not? Do you want to?
I want to.
I think this keyboard was having control as well. Do you want me to minimize this?
No, I just want to be able to see who's in the meeting. So maybe I'll push that. But then it's taking away the share. There's Taran there. Oh, is that why? Thank you. Okay. Solid explanation. Okay. Cool. What time is it? Let's go.
I've got that. Yeah. I mean, I'm not talking too long, so we'll actually have lots of time for questions. So if you do want to, you can wait a little bit if you think that people might be.
It's impossible to say. I think we should get into it. Can you hear us, Taran? Oh, did we promise to record? Is it okay if we record? Yeah. Oh, we are recording. Welcome. Good to see you all here. Welcome, Taran. It's my pleasure to introduce Doug McConnell. I met Doug 20 years ago. Do you remember? We were research assistants, respective in the GP department.
Yes, I remember that.
So much has changed. My hairline has disintegrated. Doug's has stayed the same.
It's holding on.
Good work. Doug did a master's with us in the Bioethics shortly after that. Oh, it was around the same time, wasn't it? And then PhD at Macquarie.
Yeah.
What's the PhD on?
Narrative self-governance in the context of addiction.
Terrific. Yep. And then did 5 years at the Hero Centre, where we have a number of contexts. So it's at Oxford, and is now back at Macquarie.
Yep, at the moment, yep.
And has been awarded something called a DECRA. Can you tell us what that is again?
DECRA, it's a early career researcher award.
Yeah.
There's 3 years of money and project cash.
It's fantastic to have you here with us, Doug, to present on this very interesting topic on the value of consciousness. So yes. Doug will speak for about 20 minutes, I guess, 20, 30 minutes, thereabouts.
Keep it on 30.
And then we'll have some discussion time. So over to you, Doug. Thank you.
Much. Okay, right. So this is some work that I did with Julian Savulescu. Paper's called The Balanced View of the Value of Conscience. That will make sense by the end of the talk, I hope. So, it decided to stop working now. Oh, I think that. Yeah, can you? Yeah, maybe do that. Yeah, there we go. Nice. Okay, so why do we want to know about conscience in this detail? Well, basically, there's a number of accounts about the function and value of conscience. The balanced account that I'm going to describe is one of those, but I'm going to talk through a couple of other versions of this. This might just be good to know for its own sake, but then there's obviously kind of practical implications for when we're trying to work out how to balance the value of conscience versus other interests, perhaps in a healthcare setting, but other settings as well. If conscience has heaps of value, then that's going to change the balance. If some consciences don't have much value, then maybe they can be overruled. Those kind of questions. So basically, this is the plan. We'll provide kind of the common ground, the way conscience is kind of seen in a contemporary context. I'll outline the mainstream unity view of conscience, which is pretty widely used. That's probably pretty dominant. Then I'm looking at Carolyn McLeod's critique of that and her own reaction where she creates what she calls the dynamic view of conscience, then the critique that Julian and I make of that, and where we get to subsequent to that critique, which is our balanced view. So here's the common ground. This is what most people take conscience to be. So a capacity to sense or immediately discern what one has done, is doing, or is about to do is wrong. The idea is it reflects the bearer's internalized values, whatever they happen to be. It's not some kind of special access to moral truth. It only alerts us to the wrongfulness of our own actions. It doesn't alert us to the wrongfulness of other people's actions. And it motivates action in accord with your moral commitments by threatening guilt and shame if you act against them. So it gets you to do what's right by stopping you from doing what's wrong. So people say it's kind of got this negative aspect to it. Oh, yes, so it doesn't respond readily to executive control. So it can come unbidden, and if you try to ignore it, it can nag you. So another way to kind of understand conscience is to distinguish it from deliberative moral judgment. So it's a bare commitment to morality, and we fill in the content of what conscience will defend for us using our deliberative moral judgment. Although also often, of course, we just tend to imbibe moral norms from society around us, and then our conscience will defend these. Ideally, of course, we reflectively endorse those, but obviously that's not always the case. So unlike conscience, deliberative moral judgment can allow us to assess the morality of other people's actions. It can also detect praiseworthiness, not just blameworthiness, and it's under greater executive control. Okay. Normally, conscience and deliberative moral judgment align. If conscience kind of warns us off something, were we to reflect on that, we would think, oh yes, that is wrong. That shouldn't be doing that. But there are a set of cases that create a bit of a problem. How should we understand the value of conscience when conscience and deliberative moral judgment clash? So this example was one that Carolyn McLeod puts forward of the housewife, and this is going to be a central example for us. So she imagines this housewife who has, over a long period of time, endorsed traditional wifely values. She believes she has a moral obligation to cook dinner for her husband, look after the house, and so on. But then later in life, at some point, she now rejects those. Her deliberative moral judgment is now that she doesn't have those obligations. Yet, she feels guilty if she opts out from cooking dinner. So her conscience seems to drive what she used to think was moral behavior, but now she doesn't endorse that. So you get this clash between what her conscience is saying and what her deliberative moral judgment is saying. So what do we think about these cases? The unity view, the dynamic view, and the balance view is going to give different answers here. All right, so here's the unity view. This is very widely held. The function of conscience is to promote moral unity. So whatever the unity of your moral position is, conscience is defending that for you, promoting that. And because moral unity is always valuable, then all consciences are valuable because you'll, of course, want to maintain that moral unity. And disintegration of your moral unity would seem to threaten your existence as a moral agent. So conscience exclusively alerts us to the blameworthy actions because only such actions threaten unity. So I guess what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say this seems to be on the right track because it seems to align with a number of the things that we feel conscience should be able to accommodate, phenomena that it should be able to accommodate. So it makes sense that that it's not alerting us to praiseworthy actions because it's the blameworthy ones that are more, cause more of a threat to unity. Pangs of conscience come unbidden and cannot be easily suppressed because we implicitly know that our moral unity is valuable. And so when that's under threat, we can kind of feel that kind of without having to deliberate about it. And it makes sense of claims that you hear sometimes, which is like, I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I did that, since serious violations of your moral unity might result in debilitating shame, loss of self-respect, and so on. And conscience only sanctions one's own behavior and not others, because obviously your actions don't, other people's actions don't affect your moral unity, or not directly. Okay, so there are some problems for the unity view that Carolyn McLeod raises. So one set of concerns is around whether moral unity is valuable in itself. So moral unity could form around a substantively immoral position, and then that's going to, obviously that might not be bad, well that conscience might not be good. And that thought leaves some like Alberto Giubellini to suggest that conscience itself isn't valuable. We have to just look at what the substantive moral positions are to see whether someone's position should be respected. Another concern with promoting moral unity is that it could prevent moral growth. So if you think about the housewife case, there's someone who's thinking, oh, I want to change my moral position. I now think I have a better moral position to pursue that I want to internalize, but conscience is working against that. That doesn't necessarily seem good if conscience is going to prevent you having some kind of moral growth. Then there's another set of concerns about whether conscience acts as a unity promoter in its functioning. One case that Carolyn McLeod develops is this idea of a whistleblower. So the whistleblower acts on her conscience, calling out sexism in the workplace. But then as a result of that, the sexism intensifies. She gets, basically her self-esteem gets destroyed. She ultimately goes back on her position and she loses her moral unity in this example. So it seems that acting on conscience can sometimes undermine unity. And there's another set of cases where this doesn't necessarily hit the unity view so badly, but it seems that we can also maintain our moral unity even when we fail to act on our conscience. So if you look at people in positions of power, they can act against they might act against what their moral position would be, but because their excuses are so easily accepted by other people, they find it very easy to rationalize and excuse their way out of things, and their conscience doesn't seem to be providing the function that it supposedly should. As I say, that may not be such a problem for the unity view. It just might be the case that sometimes consciences don't function that well. I have lost my capacity to move on. Oh yeah. All right. So that set of problems leads Carolyn McLeod to develop what she calls a dynamic view. So she thinks that the function of conscience is just to encourage us to act on our internalized moral values, whatever they are. So this can accommodate the whistleblower case. She acts on her moral values, happens to undermine her unity, but that's okay on McLeod's view because they were her moral values. She was just promoting them. The value of conscience depends on the extent to which it encourages us to act on our authentic moral values, values that we would endorse with our best moral judgments. Best moral judgments, I'm not going to go into some detail about what those are, just hopefully we've got some account of what best moral judgments are. So, but does that mean that the housewife's conscience lacks value because her conscience is, well, at least in regards to this particular set of issues around being a housewife, her conscience is promoting inauthentic moral values she wouldn't currently endorse. Or McLeod thinks that conscience can still have value in those cases. Well, first of all, conscience encourages us to act on our authentic moral values in two ways. So to the extent we've internalized authentic moral values, well, that's good because conscience is going to motivate us to act in accord with them. That's fine. That's relatively uncontroversial. But even when our conscience is a voice of oppression, such as in the housewife case, it can have a positive effect, she thinks. It alerts us that we have some oppressive or otherwise bad values that might be unconsciously influencing our behavior. So here we'll have I'll read the example in a bit more detail here. So this is the central aspect of her case. My conscience could encourage me to prepare dinner for my husband most nights, simply because he is my husband. It would do that by threatening me with false guilt or shame that would, my conscience would allow me to see how much these values are part of me and could prompt me to reflect on how I was relating to my spouse because of them. I say to myself, but why should I feel guilty about not making dinner? I should reject these attitudes and resist getting into patterns of wifely behavior rather than allow them to develop them. Can you click back on this thing? Yeah. So she thinks, without conscience to alert us to these oppressive values that we have internalized, their influence on our behavior might go unchecked. So conscience has value when it forces us to reconsider and revise some of our moral values. That is, when it jumpstarts retooling. When she says retooling, she's referring to adjusting the internalization of our moral values. So we might have internalized an inauthentic moral value, then through some process, which is pretty underdescribed, we can retool, we can adjust what moral values we've internalized. This is a long process. You can start to externalize traditional wifely values and maybe internalize something in their place. But the idea is that conscience can jumpstart that process. You can start to bring your executive resources to bear on the issue as opposed to not. Quick summary of what we've got then with the dynamic view. Conscience functions to motivate action in accord with internalized moral values. It doesn't necessarily protect moral unity. But conscience is only valuable when it's dynamic, when the bearer is prepared to shape his or her conscience according to their best moral judgment through this reflective retooling process. So as you do internalize the authentic moral values, well, now conscience reflects those internalized moral values, and conscience will now kind of help guide you again towards your authentic moral values. And conscience contributes to its own dynamism by jumpstarting the retooling, even when it reflects inauthentic values, and this enables moral growth. So the idea is that you have this dynamic interaction between conscience and deliberative moral judgment throughout your life. And the idea here is that this improves on the unity view. Proponents of the unity view tend to ignore the conflict between deliberative moral judgment and the recommendations of conscience. They don't tend to focus on those cases. When they do look at them, they seem to either suggest that moral judgment should fall in line with conscience. That obviously doesn't seem like a good solution for the housewife case. And sometimes they think, oh, okay, no, yes, there can be a change. Conscience can be, pushing you to have one unity, and you might ultimately switch to another unity, but it seems on the unity views model that can only occur through a massive crisis, basically, that you're kind of trying to protect one unity as long as you can, and then at some point it's like, oh no, that unity can't be protected anymore, and then you've got some kind of huge shift to some other unity. I mean, I'm sure cases like that happen, but it doesn't seem like that. Is that really the only way you can have some kind of moral growth? That doesn't seem right. So the idea is that it looks like the dynamic view does a bit better in this regard. Okay, now let's have a little look at a critique of the dynamic view that Julian and I developed. So I'm going to deflate the dynamism of conscience. The claim that conscience forces us to reconsider and revise inauthentic moral values and that jumpstarts retooling, I think, are incompatible with its function, which is encouraging us to act on our internalized moral values. I think if conscience was functioning effectively, it wouldn't just police action, it also polices deliberation and other cognitive processes, including those involved in retooling. So what I mean by that is that the housewife wouldn't just feel guilt and shame about not cooking dinner. You would assume that her conscience would also threaten guilt and shame if she seriously considered committing to the view that wives aren't obliged to cook for their husbands. I assume that conscience can also tell you when you're thinking along immoral paths. I mean, otherwise it wouldn't work very well, because it also needs to alert you before you start doing the immoral action. When you're thinking about immoral things, or at least seriously committing to them, you would think that conscience would do something to stop that. But that would mean that conscience doesn't motivate self-critical reflection, but discourages the cognitive steps required to change internalized moral values. Furthermore, I think that the way conscience promotes our internalized moral values typically preempts reflection on those values. Effortful reflection is, critical reflection is effortful. We prefer to not do any more than needed. So we tend to think and act in accord with our established position, our established commitments, unless they're interrupted or challenged in some way. So I think we generally only tend to question our voice of conscience when there's a stark conflict between what conscience recommends and our deliberative moral judgment. MacLeod sets up the housewife case in a way that there is a stark contrast. She's already committed to a lifestyle that doesn't prioritize cooking dinner for her husband. She's confident in her moral judgment, and in that context, her feelings of guilt and shame for not cooking dinner, they strike her as alien. But if she was less certain of these moral judgments, and the network of wifely moral values were more deeply internalized, these traditional wifely values, then she would, I think, tend to take that voice of conscience more at face value, and she would prematurely abandon the moral judgment that she isn't obliged to cook for her husband. She would think, oh no, that's just, be more likely to think, oh, that's just silly. That's an idea, but that can't be right. So in those cases, conscience actively prevents the reflective process. Now we make a small concession, I think, to Carolyn MacLeod's position, which is that conscience enables reflection on internalized moral values relative to cases where moral values somehow drive behavior without eliciting any guilt and shame. If such cases exist, I'm not sure. So, I take it that awareness of inauthentic moral values is a necessary precondition for bringing executive capacities to bear. So a system that alerts us to conflicts between internalized moral values and deliberative moral judgments, even as it encourages us to dismiss our reflective moral judgments, would still be better than not having such a system at all. So we'll concede that. But still, our main point is that conscience works against its own dynamism by encouraging us to both act and think in accord with our internalized moral values. So this appears to make the valuable dynamism of conscience almost entirely parasitic on reflective moral judgment, since only moral judgment can distinguish authentic from inauthentic moral values and then drive the retooling process. Okay, but now we want to reinflate the value of conscience. Apologies. Okay, so MacLeod is focused on cases where conscience reflects oppressive moral values. Now that it was just, that was suitable for her argument. She wants to show how our best moral judgment can helpfully shape conscience. But exclusive focus on those cases suggests that maximal dynamism is the goal. That leads to this idea that ideally conscience would be maximally subordinate to moral judgment. But what about cases where our moral judgment is distorted or unavailable due to cognitive load? So in those cases, a relatively automatic and stable influence, the kind of influence that conscience can provide, can promote authentic moral values better than moral judgment. So rather than the dynamism of conscience, sometimes the inertia of conscience can be helpful. One way it can help is that conscience motivates with cognitive efficiency. It's much easier to just feel a little bit of the threat of guilt and shame and act on it than engage in deliberative moral judgment. Typically, deliberative moral judgment is going to be more demanding. You need to imagine how different scenarios might turn out. You've got to assess trade-offs between different values. So without conscience, we think, we'd be more likely to make moral errors as the demands of the situation outstripped our cognitive resources. If we were having to do too much deliberative moral judgment, that would be harder work. So by letting conscience be our guide, at least some of the time, that frees up cognitive resources for other tasks. Okay, so I take it that we sometimes adopt inauthentic moral beliefs that we wouldn't endorse with our best moral judgment. Perhaps we're charmed by a charismatic speaker, we want to fit in with a group, or in a particular context, a moral position might happen to better align with our self-interested goals. we might switch our moral positions to suit. There's also suggestive evidence of a phenomenon called judgment shift, which is where you're under temptation, and while you're under temptation, first of all, you realize it's a temptation and that you'd be better to pursue the longer term goal. But the longer you're exposed to that temptation, there's evidence showing that your judgment, you start to increase your evaluation of the temptation. It's like, oh, maybe it's not so bad. There's reasons for taking that after all. And you reach an inflection point where it's like, hey, oh, that's not a temptation. That is the best option to take. Of which you later regret because you realise that that wasn't the best option to take. So I think that conscience can protect us from suboptimal moral judgments by threatening guilt and shame when we consider courses of action that go against our internalized values. The threat of guilt and shame can put an end to deliberation, thus preempting or preventing us from getting to the point of a judgment shift. Or it can prompt further deliberation, which leads us to a better quality moral judgment. So I'll illustrate these with a couple of examples. So this is Lonely Man 1. He finds an online group and he initially enjoys the social interaction of the group, but then it becomes clear that this group are white supremacists. The group invite him to an in-person event, and his conscience threatens sufficient guilt and shame at the prospect of socializing with them in person that he declines without seriously deliberating. However, he is so desperate for a wider social network that if he had deliberated, allowed himself to kind of consider the temptation more fully, then judgment shift would have led him to conclude that attending the event was morally permissible after all. So his conscience kicks in and prevents him from this tempting situation. And yeah, he would with these people, we can imagine. Now we'll take a Lonely Man number 2, a variation on this. So he hasn't internalized his anti-racist values so deeply. He attends in-person events with these white supremacists and he finds camaraderie, but he's exposed to arguments that multiculturalism is the cause of many of society's ills. He takes these arguments at face value. He wants to fit in and he had no established views about multiculturalism. Although some of the group's activities pique his conscience, such as putting up racist posters, he readily dismisses these feelings and he sides with his new anti-multicultural moral judgment, or moral as he sees it and as they press it upon him. One day, however, he agrees to accompany his new friends to threaten a local shop owner. But before entering the shop, he judges that the ends justify the means. It's a bit of nasty business, but you've got to stamp out this multiculturalism. But once he sees the frightened reaction of the shopkeeper, now his conscience elicits such strong guilt and shame that he can't join in anymore. And this experience leads him to question these new moral judgments about multiculturalism. And now he comes to see that they're incompatible with other values he has, such as treating people as free and equal. And upon further reflection, he becomes convinced that his conscience is right, and he was lured into incorrect moral judgments through his need to become part of the group. So this is hope. The idea of this is to illustrate that conscience could improve his moral judgment eventually. So it did trigger some extra reflection. So conscience doesn't motivate its own dynamism, we think. So it doesn't contribute to value in that way, its own value in that way. The main value of conscience, which Cloud overlooks, is to compensate for the limitations of deliberative moral judgment, or our kind of limitations of cognitive capacity. So we depend on our best moral judgments to ensure that conscience reflects authentic rather than inauthentic moral values. But conscience provides those authentic values with a diachronic stability that moral judgment, deliberative moral judgment alone, cannot. So the inertia of conscience is in fact what's valuable about it. But what does that mean for MacLeod's view that consciences are valuable when they're dynamic? So I think there's a trade-off. The valuable inertia of conscience can be partly incorporated in MacLeod's view, because she does note that conscience is valuable when it encourages us to act on our authentic moral values. So if I judge that eating meat is morally wrong, I'm going to be more likely to act on that judgment if it's backed by conscience. So that could fit into her view. But we have added that this motivation is also valuable when it preempts or overrides compromised moral judgments. So it can prevent me from eating meat when judgment shift would have temporarily caused me to judge that eating meat is actually morally acceptable after all, for example. But if conscience can preempt or override contrary moral judgments, then internalized inauthentic moral values will not only motivate morally inauthentic behavior, as Cloud recognizes, but it will tend to preempt or override our best moral judgments when they are happening. So we seem to face a trade-off between having a conscience that is inert enough to compensate for compromised moral judgments, but not so inert that it will override well-justified moral judgments and be impervious to retooling as driven by our best moral judgments. Can we avoid that trade-off, you might think? Ideally, we'd develop a conscience that will be maximally dynamic in response to our best moral judgments, but static in the face of our compromised moral judgments. But this would require a total understanding of the quality of our moral judgments. We would then know when to rely on conscience until our better moral judgment kicked in, and then we could ignore conscience and rely on that judgment. So here's some empirical evidence that says, unsurprisingly, I guess we're not that good at it. It seems that we can have this metacognitive feeling of rightness, so we can feel more confident in the rightness of a moral judgment that comes to us in this fluent way, apparently. But we still suffer from underconfidence in relatively well-justified judgments and overconfidence in relatively unjustified judgments. So we're not perfect metacognitive judges, unsurprisingly, and there's uncertainty. And I think there's an analogous uncertainty. I don't have evidence for this, but this seems intuitive to me. There's an uncertainty around the voice of conscience. So I think we can over or under-internalize moral values according to our best judgment of how they should be prioritized. So that the guilt and shame that is generated by conscience can be disproportionate to those values, at least the way that we would ideally arrange those values. So we're not, and I think we're not always aware of the degree to which we have internalized a moral value. So I don't think we can avoid this trade-off, given the degree of uncertainty attached to both our moral judgments and the voice of conscience. So there's inevitably an uncertainty in resolving the conflicts between them. So how should we balance moral judgment and conscience in light of this uncertainty? Well, imagine how the housewife's internal conflict developed over time. When younger, her judgment was easily outweighed by her conscience. Now remember, now this is her conscience telling her that she should be cooking dinner for her husband. Over time, her confidence in the moral judgment grew and will have eventually at some point reached an inflection point where she would sometimes act on the moral judgment, the deliberative moral judgment, and at other times she would act on her conscience. And eventually, at some point through social interactions or education or wherever she was developing extra stability or confidence in her moral judgment, that confidence would increase, that she now was very sure, much more consistently sure that the moral judgment was right, conscience was wrong in this regard, and then at that point she'd begin to retool her conscience. And then over time, the guilt and shame that it would elicit for not cooking dinner, for example, would start to decrease. So we can imagine the housewife wishing that her conscience had been more dynamic. She then would have achieved her moral growth more quickly, and at least her conscience was dynamic enough that she wasn't permanently stuck with these moral values that she would reject with her best moral judgment. Conversely, we can imagine the second lonely young man wishing that his conscience had been less dynamic. If his conscience had been a bit more inert, it might have overridden his flawed moral judgment sooner before he started attending these events and going into threatening the shopkeeper. Nevertheless, he should be pleased that his conscience wasn't even more dynamic than it was, since he would have then continued to act against what he really thought was best, treating people as free and equal. And he might even have actually started to retool his conscience so that it now aligned with these corrupt moral judgments, these kind of anti-multicultural moral judgments, and obviously, presumably that does happen sometimes. Okay, so this leads us to the balance view. Given the risks of having a conscience that's either overly dynamic or overly inert, we want to have a balance between the confidence we place on moral value and the confidence we place in conscience. And the optimal balance is going to be the one that maximizes pursuit for authentic moral values. On the balance view, the conscience is of greater value the closer it is to that optimal balance, and consciences are of lesser value to the extent they're overly dynamic or overly inert. The optimal balance is a function of the environment and capacity for moral judgment, so it's going to vary by person and within person, both over time and by context. A relatively dynamic conscience is going to be more valuable if you're in a situation where your moral judgment's rarely distorted. Rarely, not only occasionally distorted. High cognitive load is rare, and new moral knowledge regularly becomes available, because in those cases, conscience could be easily reshaped. In those cases, it's going to be benefit for conscience to be easily reshaped in the light of new knowledge, and you don't need to rely on conscience to protect you against compromised moral judgments. They're not occurring so often. Conversely, a relatively inert conscience would be more valuable when one's moral judgment is vulnerable to distortion, perhaps because of personal features or social environment. High cognitive load is common, so you often need to rely on your intuitive moral judgments. And new moral knowledge is rare, so you're not normally worried about moral growth. So in those cases, conscience would more consistently protect against compromised moral judgments. And although one would have to work harder to achieve moral growth because of your inert conscience, the need to achieve moral growth is a bit rarer, because you're not coming across so much new moral knowledge that you need to adjust. So, okay, quick illustration, nearly done. So, how might someone benefit from changing the dynamism of their conscience over time? Here's an example of this. So imagine a person who was raised in a cult but escapes and recognizes that they've internalized a warped morality that's unsuitable for the world outside the cult. They would initially benefit from developing a more highly dynamic conscience, placing little weight on the voice of their conscience when it clashes with moral judgment. And this would enable faster retooling, a faster adjustment of their internalized moral values during that phase. But it would leave them less able to compensate for cognitive load, and they'll tend to make moral errors by trusting moral judgment too readily. Later, when their retooling was largely complete, let's say they've now assimilated in normal society, they would now benefit from decreasing the dynamism of conscience so that it better compensates for the limitations of judgment. The capacity for fast moral growth is decreased then, but it's no longer needed so much if we imagine normal society is a slightly less kind of chaotic world morally. I mean, I'll make that assumption for the case, for the purposes of this example. How might someone benefit from the capacity to adjust the dynamism of conscience according to context? So imagine a surgeon, and he would benefit from an inert conscience in the operating theatre, but ethical decisions are typically under high cognitive load, and lengthening moral deliberation is likely to be detrimental. In that context, the surgeon should only let the most confident moral judgments override the recommendations of conscience. Yet we might hope that that same surgeon, when discussing options prior to surgery or when debriefing after surgery, might have a more dynamic conscience, which would be more open to being shaped by new moral arguments. And then if it was, then over time you would hope that the changes in the reflective context would influence their conscience-led behaviour in the theatre. All right, so to conclude, gone a little bit long. So we agree with MacLeod that conscience functions to promote internalized moral values rather than moral unity. That's what obviously the unity view holds. We think that the value of conscience depends on its interaction with reflective moral judgment. So we've also preserved that part of the view. And that the dynamism of conscience is relevant to its value. But we've argued to modify her view. Conscience does not motivate its own dynamism. Conscience may alert us to a conflict between moral judgment and internalized values, but it discourages reflective conclusions contrary to those internalized values. And we think MacLeod overlooks the main value of conscience, which is to compensate for the limitations of deliberative moral judgment. It can do so by providing stable moral perspective, which complements the more agile, cognitively demanding, and abstract perspective provided by moral judgment. So conscience is of greater value the closer it is to that optimal balance with moral judgment. Consciences are of lesser value to the extent they are overly dynamic or overly inert. All right, thank you. Sorry, I went a little bit long.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Doug. Okay. Still there, Taran. So just put your hand up if you want to have to say, John.
Thanks, Doug. That was thought you did a really good job of summarising a number of different positions there and number of arguments for everything. It's not a debate and an area of literature that I've dealt in, so I found it really interesting. Positions of that. I've got two questions. One is a sort of more general, I don't quite get it question, but the other is a more specific one about peril in the cloud.
Yeah.
So what I sort of wonder is when you're talking about the unity view, most of the people that were putting forward the unity view were bioethicists.
Yeah.
And conscientious objection is a thing discussed in bioethics. In my view, it's discussed far too much.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about conscientious objection, it does raise the question of what conscience is in these accounts. So conscientious objection typically occurs when I can't in conscience do this.
Yeah.
So that might lead to an account of conscience that emphasizes guilt and blame.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I was kind of thinking through this talk was, I should not have a conscience.
Yeah.
It's all the bad stuff. I just feel guilt and blame.
Yeah.
And all of the positive parts of moral feelings seem to be missed from it. So my question is, have they missed the big picture here, which is if I think about situations where I come across something, someone needs help, my conscience, I think, says it is a positive thing. Oh, I should help this person. They're in need. So I just wonder whether bioethics has gone down a negative route in terms of characterizing conscience. And I don't actually know what conscience means in any of these accounts. The closest thing I could think of was, they're like moral sentiments, like human moral sentiments.
Yeah.
And if you go down that route, you're immediately in them being both positive and negative.
Yeah.
And if you go down that route, are they really linked to moral motivation? Is conscience in this debate about moral motivation, the things that push us to act when we haven't thought? And if you go that route, then you can talk about other things like the semantic hypothesis, which I think fits well with the position that you go with. So look, these things can have value as good ways through reducing cognitive load.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering how these things fit together. That's the big general question. The second one was about one of your criticisms of cloud. I haven't read the book. So the view that the criticism that you, or the account that you give of her view is that conscience drives moral reflection and moral development. Now, does she really say that, or does she say it can? Here's some cases where it does. I don't know. I haven't read the book.
I think she means it can, because she also so she wants to say, well, some consciences are dynamic, and people are kind of, although quite why some are dynamic and some are not, I'm not sure is clear, but she thinks they're going to be more valuable when they are dynamic. So when they're alerting you to these, so they're valuable when they are alerting you to
So if that's right, then that might be a reason to just back off a little bit with that, because then the view sort of makes sense to me about those cases, which is, I'm doing this, feeling good when I don't, feeling kind of good when I do. It doesn't really make sense. And so that's a case where conscience can drive reflection of what my values are, and is my sentiment taking the right route.
Oh, so I don't know if I quite followed that second part you were saying. So,
well, so suppose you're kind of habituated to having a certain kind of, I'm just going to talk about moral sentiments now because I know it.
Yeah.
Suppose you kind of find, I feel good when I cook dinner, I feel bad when I don't. And over time, you come to question your sentiments about that situation and reflect upon it.
Yeah.
That seems to me like quite a plausible story. And if she's not saying it always drives it, other things might drive it, then the door's open to you. So what you really do is, I think, is augmenting her account.
So that is actually how I largely see it as well. I don't, in some ways, maybe I've setting up the dialectic makes it seem that we're kind of more aggressively going after it. But I think it's more like, because we accept a large part of what she's saying, and we're like, it's more like we're saying, well, that's mostly right. It's slightly over egged. We just trim a little bit off that, and then we'll add our piece in here, and that's how I see it. So maybe that aligns with your kind of take on it. The kind of the focus on the negative of conscience is an interesting one. I do wonder why, perhaps there's a religious element driving here as well.
I just wonder whether the unity view itself, like when people talk about conscience objection, people say, oh, it's really important that people cannot do abortions, so their conscience isn't damaged and their moral unity is preserved. I just wonder whether the assumptions of that debate has driven the unity view, but also that it's guilt and shame.
Yeah. I mean, it could well be. I mean, what they might want to say about your case of wanting to go help someone. I mean, they're going to try and say, at least if you have to stick to the view, it's like, oh, it's in a way, it's the threat of guilt and shame. Were you not to help them? But
it's too negative. No, it makes you feel good when you. And God.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
So I have to do this.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I'm going to feel so good when I do.
I agree with that. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think, but behind this, with the way I've set it up as kind of deliberative moral judgment versus conscience, then you think, well, so is conscience just the intuitive set of moral judgments? So you say sentiment, but that doesn't seem quite right according to the way it's been set up, because it's like, oh, conscience doesn't tell you anything about the morality of other people's behavior, for example, or praiseworthy things over blameworthy things. But you might think, oh, well, now you've just kind of artificially paired off a subset of sentimental.
Sorry, Tom, can I continue on?
Oh, and there's another comment to come. So.
Just add one point to that. So doesn't conscientious objection also look at cases where claims in good conscience let that person do this?
Yeah.
So I don't think that's right. I think it can be my conscience says that this person can't do this thing, which is wrong.
Yeah, I think they would still try to. Yeah, so it's going to be a different subset of examples. I mean,
blow the whole thing up.
Yeah,
moral sentiment.
Look, I'm not totally against that. We can talk more about that later. Sorry, let's.
Over to Neil.
So this may follow on from John's, and of course I came in late. I don't have a conscience at the moment. I don't know why. I just don't care. No, I was unavoidable with that. I just wonder, and I'm not sure where this takes us, whether conscience is a kind of folk psychology concept.
Yeah.
And because it's a kind of folk psychology concept, we're pretty free to attach it to all kinds of behaviors. And you had those, I hadn't, you had the two stories, three stories.
The housewife and the two loners.
The housewife and the two. And then I can think of 50 other stories, which you find in novels. And,
of course, yeah.
And I just wonder whether, as I say, it's a kind of folk idea that just covers a huge range of behaviours and, maybe does some explanatory work, but it's not explanatory work that would stand up to a tremendous amount of analysis.
Yeah.
Just wondering.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right. Like the folk use it more broadly, and it seems to be a classic case where philosophers have come along and said, all right, let's just try and systematize this. These things kind of seem to hang together, so it feels like, so it's kind of saying, oh, the folk are onto something here, and then they come along and they like try and see what can be made to hang together, and of course maybe some uses of it don't fit that definition, and then what normally happens is philosophers go off and say, well, we're using the philosophy notion of conscience, even though other people might use it differently, and then of course you get into the debates about, well, is that worth people's time, or should you just use a different, should we just be talking about moral sentiments, because maybe that's going to align better with a set of kind of perhaps scientific work. I mean, I think it's true that when you start looking at the clash that you get with the housewife, this is kind of an unusual case. I think most times people refer to their conscience, they are assuming it's a situation where moral judgment and conscience just align. It's not, and so it just, they wouldn't see that distinction. So, I mean, I don't know necessarily what to make of that, but basically, yeah, you raise a problem, and I'm not sure in this case what to do. Like, is it? I mean, it's in some ways a familiar problem. Is it a total waste of time to be doing philosophy of conscience around focusing on conscience? There's a hell of a lot of it out there already. I don't know. That's a practical, kind of a practical challenge. Yeah. Yeah.
It's internalized values.
Yeah.
Which you're equating with conscience.
That I've borrowed that from McLeod.
Yeah. Looked like something less folky, doesn't it? So it looks as though it's got it's got more internal structure to it, because the values, well, you can ask, where do they come from?
Yeah.
And then internalization is also something that you could put a bit of structure around. So, I mean, maybe that does some more work, that conscience, if I'm just thinking it's a folk thing, that, which is not to knock it, by the way, because I think we ought to have a lot of time for folk psychology, especially given what non-folk psychology does when you just remove the folk stuff and you're left with the neuropsychology or whatever. But yeah, okay. So I'm just raising the question, trying to.
All I can do is just kind of acknowledge that issue, but it's not. I think there's not a perfect way forward, is there? You can kind of,
Thanks, Neil. Over to Emma.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I don't come from a philosophy background in the sense of the words, so
that's good.
So, and I followed it, so that's good for me.
Those books.
I was just wondering, it's kind of following on, I guess, from this idea of where do values come from, this idea of group conscience, if you like.
Oh yeah.
So in both of your examples, you've got the housewife, and you could argue that the housewife's moral values or whatever changed as society changed its values. And same with the lonely man, both of those, they were looking to the community, if you like, and kind of got their values from the community.
Yeah.
So how does all of that come into play in terms of a group conscience and whether values change over time at a collective level?
Yeah. So I think the idea of a group conscience probably isn't compatible with this kind of discussion, because this conscience has to come with some kind of phenomenology. If it's set up in this way, either being able to experience guilt or shame, or perhaps positive sentiments as well, we broaden it out. Most people, I think, would say that even though you might, yes, it could be group agency, definitely, but I think you get into a bit of a weird place if you say that the group as a whole experiences some kind of moral sentiment or guilt and shame. But okay, but set that aside, because obviously there is this other part, which is like there's the morality of society, and that the way that changes over time, and how that kind of. So I think that I think just kind of I guess I'm a kind of moral realist, but there's things that change over time in terms of what moral norms are accepted, or at least how they're supposed to be expressed. And it depends what you want to get at there, but there's some work that shows that we kind of unconsciously imbibe the norms from our society. through a variety of different needs. And there's a bunch of we work in a field of master narratives of like the stories that are right that you should live according to. There's just a bunch of other little things. So we pick up norms of how things are done here. We pick those up without knowing. I mean, in philosophy, people think that of course, even though that happens, the ideal rational agent would hopefully at some point expose all the moral norms they're committed to some degree of reflection, and hopefully, endorse, reject, even though obviously that is an ideal agent that we're not all like that. But were you driving somewhere? That's how I see the interaction between the group kind of moral norms, the moral pressures of society and the individual. So the individual conscience will be somewhat at the mercy of the moral norms that society promulgates, for better or worse. So I mean that's.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking what of, say, even why we have medical ethics in New Zealand, is because something went wrong, everybody recognised collectively, we should do this again. We should treat people better, whether it's negative or positive, and then you have codes from there on that everybody follows.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting case. I mean, there's also interesting. Why is there medical ethics, but there's not so much in the way of financial ethics? But I mean, obviously, there's I have some thoughts about that, but I'll get off track.
Let's go to Mark. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Doug. It's really interesting. I really enjoyed that. I was just thinking about what Neil was saying there. Is it possible that conscience is a subset of values that are so foundational to our sense of self that they become kind of indistinguishable for some immutable entity? Because you were talking about having to retool moral frameworks. Is it possible to retool your conscience? Do you think conscience is something that's innate and immutable throughout your life?
I think there's two aspects to that, I guess. I think the idea that you have some conscience of any kind, I think that's like a kind of a bare commitment to morality. So you might, if you don't have a conscience at all, I'm not sure if you can, if you're that kind of psychopath, I'm not sure if you can necessarily have one made or gain one. But I do think that you can adjust your moral values, even like deep ones. It maybe doesn't happen that often. There's probably are self-transformative experiences that take a lot of time, I guess. But I think it can happen. But I do see them as like kind of core to your sense of who you are. So there's something that the moral unity view is getting right. That when your core moral values are threatened, you feel threatened. I do see it like that.
Yeah, it just strikes me as being the part of you that acts sometimes as an anchor and sometimes as a stick. And it's got a good nose for bullshit when you're trying to keep yourself.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, again, this kind of gets to a question of like how much stuff we want to bring under the kind of umbrella of conscience, and how much other intuitive kind of capacities you have to recognize and respond to things around you. The conscience is supposed to somehow capture the at least the moral aspects. There might be others, but then again, kind of like some of John's concern is like, to what extent are we kind of dividing things up? What's the justification for dividing things up in this way? I don't know.
Thanks. I have a comment on this, but I've just said. I have spent a little bit of time reading this literature, and the people that argue strongly for, and it's conscientious objection where I've seen it discussed, so it is in the context of this bioethical debate. They just define conscientious objection as having views about what's right and wrong, so it is equivalent to moral deliberation. And the debate really is to what extent should we accommodate and allow individuals to decide what's right and wrong, usually in a professional context. And there's the history all around that. So conscientious objectors to war were vilified at the time, and it wasn't thought that they should have the right to do that. But now we look back differently, and that's kind of confirming Emma's point. This is all socially moderated in terms of the norms of the day. It is striking to me that none of the major moral philosophers have a distinct category of conscience, distinct from moral deliberation. So it seems to me the way you guys have cast it is pretty much as a sort of a psychological property whereby some people are more flexible in what they think, more open to, and to shift their assumptions or existing, whereas some will dig in. So yeah, that's how I view this issue in the broader debate as well. It's more like when and how much should we accommodate individual views.
Yeah, however
the way John cast the anti-abortionist, that's unsympathetic, because you don't share that view. But to really fully appreciate this debate, we have to say, what if I was asked to do something that I found morally objectionable, and should I be allowed to do that in my job as a such and such? And so, what was Martin Luther right to object to all the things that the Catholic Church told him he had to do as a priest or a monk? And many people thought he was, but it led to an awful lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And so it's debatable.
So I think one reason. So I agree that it's generally described like this is my individual moral position. Doesn't matter whether it's conscience or moral judgment I've got to that I should be allowed to do it. But if it's like, if it's just your moral judgment, then I think sometimes people say, well, if it's a moral judgment, we should be free to debate any kind of moral judgment. You shouldn't feel particularly attached to that. You shouldn't feel too threatened by that if I tell you you're wrong. And we might still allow you, but it feels like you're more open up to some kind of debate. Whereas sometimes the appeal to conscience is to say, you can't touch, it doesn't matter. You can't touch me now. Like, this is my conscience. If you threaten my conscience, you strike me. Kind of in some other deeper sense. Now, acting on your moral judgment maybe does do the same thing. So maybe this distinction doesn't ultimately make a difference, a practical difference. But one way it might make a difference. But no, I just think of Alberto Giubilini's argument against conscience. If conscience just promotes whatever moral value you have, then he thinks, well, conscience itself then doesn't have any value. The value is something to do with the quality of your moral judgment, or perhaps the content of your moral judgment.
It's just to call conscience as dogmatism, which I think is it's got to be a straw man. I don't know anyone that actually, well, maybe there are people. It's been interesting with the assassination in the US, where what is the Bondi lady? What's her? She's the
Anne Bondi.
Yeah. So she came out and said, she's actually made comments that we should be restricting hate speech. And, that's kind of being viewed very negatively by people that would normally agree with her. And it's this reaction people have to what is an assumed, morally right position. And the debate kind of reignites over what should people be free to say, just because they happen to think it. Anyhow, we're actually at 12. Thanks for all the comments. And does anyone else want to throw up any thoughts? I guess you can stick around a bit, Doug.
Yeah.
Further discussion. Okay, well, let's. I thank you, Doug, for.
Questions?
Cool. See you later, Taryn.
So, could the people that are talking about this, McLeod and others, do they try and define conscience?
Yeah. This is it's kind of like what I had at the front with the common ground.
Yeah.